Hello. This session picks up from the filmed lecture I gave you on report writing last week. So let's take stock of where we are with report writing. I gave you a lecture in trimester 1, which was a general introduction to report writing and to the genre of scientific writing. I placed the report within that genre and talked to you about general things. The lecture that I gave you in trimester 1 set report writing within the genre of scientific writing, which is factual, objective, and it's the stuff of science. And it is always important to remember that the sections which we break down the report writing, or for that matter any species of scientific writing, the sections that we break it down into must work together as an organic whole. The slides for the lecture I gave you in trimester 1 are still on Blackboard should you wish to refer to them. At last week's filmed lecture, I was able to take a step closer to your report and how the material which we have placed on the MAM for your use will inform that report. And I'm going to say something about that today, but I first of all want to introduce you to the material that's on the MAM to show how it can inform your portfolio of sound recordings. So let's take a look at the material which is on the MAM, and I'm going to focus on one particular package of the 12 which are there. I'm not going to tell you how to write the report, and I'm not going to tell you how to assemble your portfolio of sound recordings. Now that doesn't mean you can't ask for advice and guidance in these final weeks from John and Ash and myself. Of course we will help you, but we're not going to tell you what to do. That final step has to be taken by you. I'm going to look at the brass band recordings which have been made available on the MAM for your use. There are in fact 3, and I'm going to look at one of those. All 3 recordings, which are called on the MAM Knaresborough, Rothwell, sometimes Rothwell Temperance Band, and Driglington. They've all been provided by an old colleague and friend of mine of my BBC days. He records brass bands for radio programmes, and he's provided us not only with the raw materials for one particular layout, but he's actually produced several stereo configurations, and so you can choose for whichever one you want to use. Interestingly, you can't really claim that you've made these recordings. Of course you have made recordings, but none of them were on the brass bands. But you can say that you've chosen the particular stereo configuration. And of course there are other things as well that you can do, other solo mics and spot mics that have been included in the package, which you can add to the mix if you think it appropriate. Now the format for these radio programs, which my friend adopts, is to go to a brass band, so usually in the north of England. The program is called From the Band Room, and a band room really is very often a community hall, not particularly good acoustics. The band rehearse there, and a recording is made. Very often the acoustics are poor, the ceilings are low, they sound a bit boxy, you know, and they're not ideal places to record music. They're ideal to rehearse but not to play. Now there is one exception to these, and it was the one that was made at Driglington just before Christmas. It was a carol concert and it took place in St Paul's Church, Driglington. The acoustic was quite nice, and there was a congregation. So it was more like a proper concert, and I'm going to suggest to you that this is a good one to choose of the 3, and I'm going to speak about it now. The band played in the concert about 15 pieces which are suitable. Even so, there are some which will be preferred. There was a choir, but it was small in number, and it wasn't really large enough to match the size of the band. So the choral numbers are probably best left aside for the moment. But there's still a lot to choose from, and all of the numbers are about 4 to 5 minutes. So you could take one or two of those pieces from the Driglington recording, and you would be well on the way then to completing your portfolio. The material which has been made available to you consists of about 20 discrete audio tracks. Some of them belong in stereo arrays, and some of them are just standalone spot mics. You don't have to synchronize these. They all start and stop at exactly the same time, so the same timing for one track is the same for them all. And for example, if you take the basses mic and you go to a particular timing in that, you'll find that all of the other instruments fall into line with it. And you also find that on that basses track, for example, you've got the whole concert. So you've got the bass parts for the whole concert, in other words. I've provided you with a list of timings, which gives you the start for the 15 or 16 numbers in the program. So let's review first of all these tracks, these audio tracks. Some of them belong in stereo arrays. So we have, for example, binaural, coincident pair, ORTF, spaced pair, and Decca tree. Now, as it happens, the spaced pair belong in the Decca tree. If you refer to my lecture from trimester 1, you'll remember that two of the mics in the Decca tree roughly correspond to the spacing of a spaced pair, and therefore my friend has provided just those two mics. Now, of the mics that don't belong in a stereo configuration per se, you have the announcer. Now, you may not need the announcer's mic because you may not want to put announcements into your portfolio, but of course if you do, then you've got the announcements if you need them. Then we've got basses, I mentioned those before. We've got choir left, choir right, drums overhead, the kick drum, the horns, percussion left, percussion right, and a soloist mic. Interestingly, for those of you who remember my lecture in trimester 1 when I was talking about the coverage of the orchestra, I mentioned the need for spot mics, and there are two main reasons why we would need a spot mic. The first reason is that if you've got a significant soloist in an ensemble, and I'm thinking perhaps of the concerto, it's handy to be able to adjust the relative levels of the solo against the ensemble. Now, if you're relying on the main pair to cover the soloist, you're not going to have that control. So we tend to put a solo mic out. Now then, you'll remember I also mentioned to you when we were talking about this in trimester 1 that the sound supervisor of the BBC Philharmonic tends to put a pair out for the soloist. The reason for this is that if you fade up a solo mic, if you're covering the soloist on a single mic, it does tend to collapse the stereo image. And that's why the sound soup of the BBC Phil has a tendency to put two microphones out and to space them a little bit to try and maintain that width. By the way, the issue about whether it's better to have a pair of microphones covering the soloist in a concerto might be something that you might want to include in your discussion section in the report, which I'll come to a bit later on. The other reason for using solo mics per se is that some instruments, and I'm thinking particularly of metal percussion instruments, they do benefit from being close mic'd. Some metal percussion instruments sound particularly rattly if you don't mic them separately. You only have to have a little in the mix, but it just helps the sound if you can have something close for those transients that come from those types of instruments. Tambourine jingles are notorious in this respect. You know, if you can get the mic close to those sorts of instruments, it does sound a little bit tighter. So ideally, a stereo configuration with a few spot mics is probably what you're going to be aiming for. And when it comes to write your report, I think discussions about these various things will be fairly essential in the report that you make. Also in the folder, in addition to the microphones that we've just been discussing, there are a number of other files which I'll briefly describe to you now. There is the finished radio program from Driglington, which went out on Christmas Eve end of last year. Then there is a running order, which is useful for you to work out what's coming next. And if you're looking for a particular piece, there is a sheet with the running order and the timings on. There's also a plugging sheet, and that tells you what tie lines were used between the stage and the truck on the night. And I can tell you there's a clue in there to which stereo configuration the sound supervisor used in the end, because of course he had the same choices as you have. And if you read between the lines on the plugging sheet, you'll be able to work out which one he used, I suspect. So let's think about how we're going to monitor and assess and analyze the material that you have. It's important, in my opinion, that you listen to a pair and listen to both halves of that pair. It's not a good idea to just listen to one track, unless you're chasing a fault, of course. If you think you've heard a bit of a buzz on something there, you're obviously going to try and search for that. But essentially, listen to them as pairs, or in the case of the Decca tree, there are 5 microphones in that configuration, and it's good to listen to them all as a stereo array. When you've done that and you've chosen the one that you think is the one you're going to go for, then it would be a question of having a listen to some of the solo mics and the spot mics to see whether you need to bring some of those in to add those to the stereo mix. Those are decisions to make further down the line, it seems to me. But when you add some of these spot mics in, you very rarely need them up, fully faded up for the whole piece. Now let's have a serious think about how we connect all of this stuff with the report you've got to write. It seems perfectly obvious to me. It may not be obvious to you, but I have omitted one important instruction that you should observe all the way through the work that you're doing on the audio tracks, and that is make notes. The notes that you make will inform your technical report. The step that you take to connect your work with the report is precisely that one. Make notes and use the notes to inform the report. Let's have a look at what we're going to put into the report. You need to begin with an introduction. We've spoken quite a bit about introductions. The introduction is a bookend of the conclusion, and so there needs to be some correspondence between those two entities. But in the introduction, you might want to say that this was an experiment to see which stereo configuration worked. That's basically what it's about. The next section is design, and you can use the design section to describe the arrays in some detail. Don't forget, you have lots of material there on Blackboard that I put there in trimester 1, and there's more of it gone on in trimester 2, so there's stacks of stuff there. If you want me to send you any drawings from the lectures, and you can't find them, please let me know and I'll get them over to you by return. After design, we have the results section. The results section can be the assessment of the different types of arrays that you've used. And this is where, in audio work, we sometimes struggle for vocabulary. What are we going to say about certain microphones or certain arrangements of microphones? That the sound was brighter or softer, or there was more clarity, resonant, robust, solid. And then there's of course the whole issue of stereo precision. When you listen to it, was it kind of not really that clear where instruments were coming from, or were they easily identifiable in the stereo picture? These are the sorts of discussions that you need to have in the results section. In the discussion section, you'll be wanting to say, if you can, why some arrays worked better than others. You know, and the need for spot mics. These are the kind of discussions that are going to crop up, and the discussion section is the proper place for those to be recorded. When you get to the conclusion section, you have two things to consider. You need to tie up all the threads. You need to wrap up all of your thoughts into one nice little bundle that goes into the conclusion section, and it has also to pay some correspondence to the introduction section. A good report somehow comes home in the conclusion section. There are other sections that I mentioned last week, and I mentioned them when we discussed report writing in trimester 1, and I haven't mentioned them today. I'm thinking of things like referencing and citations and stuff like that. You have to do a certain amount of work on those sections, and I haven't mentioned it today, so please don't forget that. Make sure that you do reference things properly. There's always a section in scientific writing called further work. It's how you recommend to the next researcher who comes along where you think they ought to pick up the baton. One final thought, of course, is you have to write a report on all of the stuff that's in your portfolio. And so essentially you need to work out how to structure your report. If I send 4 pieces of recording in, do I want 4 reports? Well, technically you do, but you may find a way that you can have one report with 4 subsections in it. One on the brass band, one on spoken word, perhaps one on rock music or something or other, and one on something else. But yes, there's a way of doing it. Ask us for advice. We've got lots of time to sort that out. But you do have to provide a report which covers all of the elements of your portfolio of recordings. Well, I hope you found that useful. You can come back to Ash or myself or John if you want to ask for advice. We have plenty of time left, but there's no time to waste, but we do have plenty of time left. So good luck and keep safe.